Welcome to episode 157 of TMBS. I'm Matt Leck. With me, Alicia Brooks.
Hello.
And David Griscom.
How's it going?
It's going okay, considering many things, David. Tonight on the show, we're going to have Marshall Steinbaum on to talk about a way gig workers may be sold out and the current slate of labor law versus the slate that Harvard Law would like to propose. And we might also touch on Nancy McLean being right, one of my favorite topics. Dave's going to have a gem for us. And then we're going to have Jeremy D. Johnson returning to the program with a conversation with Alicia Brooks on left empathy, integral theory, the Jeremy D. Johnson stuff that you remember him talking to Michael about. So, hey guys, how you doing? Happy Tuesday, first Tuesday without Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
I was bated breath. I was like, without what? Yes.
Yeah. Well, I should have been obvious.
Our patron saint.
Yeah. It's interesting, like, how to address this sort of moment, because it's like, look, if you're somebody who wants to celebrate the justice without, consideration of, her full voting record or judicial record and the strategic political decision she made at the end of her life, this probably isn't really the show or YouTube clip or however you're coming across is for you, I guess. Because, I don't have a huge appetite for that personally.
Yeah, but it is a theme that we see just so often now with virtue signaling and people kind of just having a sliver of context and then feeling like they're just operating, doing 100% the right thing and justified in their opinion without any depth.
Yeah, I saw Rachel Nichols, the ESPN reporter, complaining that the NBA didn't show solidarity with Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And it's like...
What would that look like?
Like, first of all, one of the more recent things she's done in public politics,
criticize Kaepernick.
Yeah. So, maybe not the right audience. I don't know. It's like, how for people who want to celebrate the salutary things about her record, that's fine. But there shouldn't be sentiment sent towards people who want to put this in a broader context. I think is my position. But David, you want to put this in the broader context of the Supreme Court as a whole, and
in general, yeah. And so first, I would start that the point that you're making about RBG is very right in the sense hits on something that's very important for us to remember, that the Supreme Court, especially in liberals' mind, is this kind of holy, almost spiritual, position instead of being what it is, which is a body of justices who are representing actual material positions and class power, right? The Supreme Court is way too powerful in our democracy, and it's fundamentally an anti-democratic organization. Now, you're talking about, the passing of RBG, and look, we can talk all about the strategy and why she should have stepped down under Obama and all of that, but let's just talk about where we are today. We've seen the slide from a 5-4 conservative majority into now a very likely 6-3 majority, which is going to be a massive impediment to any kind of progressive change. And it could also very likely and more likely mean, significant rollbacks for the country. All of the people that Donald Trump has been floating are horrifying, from Barrett to Joan Larson. These are people who are very much staunch conservatives, and they will participate in this ongoing and ongoing conservative war that they've been waging through the courts. And the Democratic Party should do everything that they can to fight against the Trump appointment, including shutting down Congress to prevent a further right-wing slide. But I'll tell you what's not going to work: appealing to a GOP sense of honor or citing RBG's last wishes. These are losing strategies. One of my favorite moments of this last campaign, the presidential campaign, was Pete Buttigieg, his plan for reforming the court, which was to expand it to 15 justices and have, 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, and 5 apolitical justices. Now, this gets at something. It's obviously a ridiculous strategy. But this really hits at two fundamental problems with the Supreme Court and a kind of opportunity that we have. The first problem is that the Supreme Court is just too powerful. And even liberals are starting to realize that that's the case. That's the fundamental aspect of the Pete Buttigieg plan, right? Is that the Supreme Court's, basically looks like it's going to be out of any kind of semblance of normalcy or liberal control for a very long time. But instead of taking the right action, in my opinion, which would be to say, okay, what we need to do is we need to weaken the political power of the court. You come up with this bizarre, wonky solution that also has this idea. This is what's so funny about liberals, even in their fantasy. They create these bizarre systems that would never work because there is no such thing as an apolitical justice. There is no such thing as somebody who's going to rule on significant constitutional crises that does not have a very well-formed political position. What we have to do as socialists is we have all these different strategies that we can go forward right now. And I'm not here to say this is the one and only way to do it, right? Look, you want to pack the court. I think that that's not going to work in the long term. The only thing that it could do, which would be beneficial, would be weaken the court, right? I like Bernie's idea of potentially cycling justices. But the fundamental problem with the Supreme Court is that it's an anti-democratic body. It's always been a tool that's been used to protect the minority. Those in power, not minorities and people who are threatened by power. So the classic argument for the court is that it protects the minority from the tyranny of the majority. Look at American history and show me when that's been the case, right? I mean,
the minority meaning the minority of property owners, basically. That's the one they're concerned about.
And, honestly, you go back to the Federalist Papers, and that was very much the understanding of the framers as well, right? Was that fundamental to this idea of democracy, there was always going to be a question about class and property. And they tried to put in as many protections for those people who had significant amounts of property and privilege from ever being challenged by, the majority, the working people of this country, right? That's the minority that the Supreme Court has always protected. It was not there for the Native Americans. It certainly was not there for all the people in slavery. And it was not there for the Japanese when it came to, internment. Just classic, you can go decade by decade and see the failures of the Supreme Court to live up to that kind of mandate. What we need to do is we need to have a strong political push that delegitimizes the courts in the imagination of many liberals and people who are sort of on our side. We're starting to see that. Literally, even Pete Buttigieg, and obviously it was a cowardly idea, but even the fact that they're trying to talk about court reform on a certain level, that's an opening for us. But we really need to start hammering home the radical position that the Supreme Court should not be above Congress, and it certainly should not be above the president. And there's historical precedent for that. I highly suggest people take some time to read Matt Karp's article in Jacobin. I can't remember the title of it right now, but it's something along the lines of how Lincoln and the radical Republicans, approached the court. And in that period of time, you had a court that was upholding slavery as the law of the land. And when, the Republicans came into power and they tried to push back against that system, the Supreme Court knew that they had lost that fight. They had lost the political fight to override the presidency and Congress. And that's how Lincoln and the Republicans were able to win that fight on a legal level, right? Because they won the political fight. And we need to understand that when we're dealing with the Supreme Court, it's a political institution that has to be struggled against on that terrain. If we don't understand that, if we try to constantly reform this court, if we continue to respect and uphold its role as this kind of vestige of reactionary class power for the wealthy, we'll never be able to push forward the kind of democratic socialist policies that we want to in the future. That's just the facts of the matter. And we need to point this and direct this argument as fundamentally an argument about democracy, that we should not have 9 people who are above all of politics and above all of society, basically holding power until they die or until they're infirm. That's not a democratic system, and it sounds absurd on its face when you describe it in that way. That's the kind of strategies that we need to be moving forward and the way that we need to start framing our struggle against the Supreme Court. Oh, you're muted.
What you said about, the imaginations of liberals, we need to, this is actually not that big of a task, really. I don't know if people remember Ian Millhiser. He's now at Vox. He did a tweet that was kind of embarrassing, which is around Trump, which, look, in light of the current events, it doesn't look as embarrassing as at the time. But said, I have not been arrested by anyone in Donald Trump's government. This tweet will repeat tomorrow if it remains true. And he never repeated it because it was a bit hysterical, right? Nonetheless, this guy wrote his main book was Injustices for All or something like that, in the mid 2000s, basically drawing this arc. Yes, at no point in this institution's history is it actually working for the people. It's a check on popular will. That's all it is. So people get too fundamentalist about liberals always break fast, right? It's a decent rule of thumb in certain cases, but in terms of, I think this particular argument, this is not something foreign to American liberalism. And I think it is something we just need to reboot, which is how I'd frame it.
No, I would also just add too that liberals have this kind of fetish for proceduralism, right? And that these institutions are apolitical or they're above politics, they're above partisanship. But when you look at the complete dysfunction of the Supreme Court, it's one of those things where it's not an abstract argument to make anymore. It's very clear that the Supreme Court is completely lost for them. And that's when you'll start to see them start to, to move a little bit on the question too.
Yeah. I think it is heartening, it's obviously the timing of this and what's at stake within the system we are still, having to live within is scary. But I think the amount of people who are waking up to the reality of what the Supreme Court is heartening. There's never been, at least in my awareness, and maybe I've just been, out to lunch, which, I think for most of Obama's presidency, I was kind of lulled to sleep. But there has not been this much just talk around what actually is the Supreme Court, who does it serve, and how does it function. And I'm seeing all sorts of discourse, the way we've always talked about the Electoral College and how we have to get rid of it. Now that's really rising up with the Supreme Court. And I find that to be really heartening.
Likewise with things like DC statehood and Puerto Rican statehood, things like that. Puerto Rican statehood's a bit more complicated, but DC should definitely have representation.
I think Puerto Rican statehood was more on my radar just because on the East Coast, there's just, I think, more proximity and more, people from there over here discussing it. I don't know if that's regional, but absolutely DC as well.
I mean, I'd even add, we should start delegitimizing the Senate. I mean, and things like the filibuster, major checks on those things. The Senate needs to be recognized for what it is as well. I mean, that's maybe Supreme Court.
The thing is with the Senate, though, is
you just went crazy slow-mo on my end.
Oh, me? Am I still here?
Yeah, you're still there, Matt.
Oh, okay.
The thing is with the Senate, though, it's hard to say, but I feel like the Supreme Court is just so much more in reach actually at this point because.
Are you guys there?
Yeah.
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 Okay. It's so much more in reach just because what you have to do basically is you have to push back its ability to overrule laws passed by Congress and put in place by the president. While the Senate, it's you have to dissolve an entire body, which, I mean, I agree completely that the Senate is another anti-democratic institution as well. But I mean, at the same time, it's who knows? During the populist movement, that was a big part of the populist fight, was to make sure that the Senate was democratically elected instead of elected by state legislatures. Right. So, anything's possible. And I think actually, if I could just as a pin on it, if I wanted to say anything in this moment, specifically about the Supreme Court and all of our kind of social strategies, it's don't cling to empty slogans, right? Don't have fantasy politics, but we need to have the kind of confidence and enthusiasm and kind of radical thinking that we are prepared to say things that mean fundamentally changing the way that politics operates in this country. Because that's the only way that we're going to be able to put in our vision of the future.
Absolutely. All right, should we get to Marshall?
Let's do it.
All right. Here he comes now. Yeah. So joining us now, assistant professor in economics at the University of Utah. There he is. Hey, Marshall.
Hi, good to be on.
Good to have you. He's also one of the best economics follows on Twitter, econ_Marshall, I believe it is. And he's a leading knight in the Nancy MacLean was largely correct order, which we'll maybe touch on later. But first, we want to talk about this clean slate for worker power report put out by Harvard. But before we get to there, tell us about the current slate of labor law and what it means for gig workers and the significance of California Assembly Bill 5.
Sure. So right now, the way that labor markets are regulated, basically a lot hinges on the employee classification or being a legal employee. And what that means in the context of labor law is that you have access to the rights that are enumerated federally in things like the Fair Labor Standards Act. So that would be the federal minimum wage, maximum hours, and overtime. And then under the National Labor Relations Act, basically the right to collectively bargain and join a union. Both of those laws have a concept of employment status. They're slightly different between the two. And then in every state, there's also a legal definition of employment, and that would qualify you for all manner of state protections. Also things like Social Security, unemployment insurance, social insurance of all kinds. Basically, if you are a legal employee, your boss has to pay the employer's share of that. So the way that those are financed, well, at least the way Social Security is financed, it's split between employers and employees. If you're an independent contractor, so the opposite of a legal employee, then you have to basically pay both sides of that equation. So you have to pay both the employer's share and the employee share. And if you're an independent contractor, as is implied by everything I was just saying, you're not protected by minimum wage laws. For example, if a company has a health insurance plan, then and you're an employee, then you have to be included in that health insurance plan, and they can't have like different plan. I mean, they can't sort of discriminate among their employees in terms of access to a benefit like that, but they can not provide such a benefit if you're an independent contractor. So, and I should say also, more hinges on that now on this definite on whether you are or not a legal employee than was the case when those laws were passed and this concept of legal employment kind of was established in the 1930s, because so much of the welfare state and other benefits are kind of conditioned on work. Then whether you are or not an employee also determines whether you're entitled to benefits of that kind. It's not a perfect mapping between sort of all of these different areas that it matters, but that's the basic setup. So the gig economy, insofar as that kind of catchphrase means anything, refers to employment that is outside the bounds of a legal employment, or sorry, I should say work that's outside the bounds of legal employment. And what California AB 5 does is basically impose or ratify a definition of employment that is favorable to gig workers in terms of establishing themselves as legal employees. So the question is sort of who is an employee, who's an independent contractor, has a lot of case law sort of behind it, as well as statute. And it hinges on things like control. I mean, so there's many things that hinge on it, but one big one is control. So basically, in the course of your work, are you being told what to do versus do you have discretion over the way that you do your work? And that's kind of why there has to, there's no way sort of around some distinction like this. There's definitely a lot of ambiguity about where the line could be drawn, but there sort of has to be a category of worker that is independent, that is not a legal employee, because think of a job, with that really like a gig in the sort of colloquial sense of the term, like a musician playing at one bar, for example, on once, is that bar then responsible for paying Social Security versus is that a sort of independent gig? And that would, if that was being adjudicated, would come down to do they play the music that the musicians want to play, or do they play the music that the bar wants to play? That kind of question. So to give a little more background on AB 5, this California Supreme Court basically ruled that California state law already required this more stringent test that would make more workers employees. It's called the ABC test. The California Supreme Court ruled that a few years ago, and then the California state legislature basically passed a law that said, yes, that Supreme Court ruling is in fact what state law requires, because the law itself as written didn't say this is what it was, but the Supreme Court was interpreting the law, and the legislature kind of came back in and removed any ambiguity about the Supreme Court's judgment by essentially changing the law to be consistent with the ruling that the Supreme Court had made. And what that would do is a lot of currently non-employed workers in California would be reclassified as employees. Now, because this is already a Supreme Court ruling, as well as already a law, there's been a lot of controversy about the existing gig economy and specifically the ride-sharing companies essentially declining to comply with the law. And so they have been sued by the California Attorney General, as well as some, I think, like local states attorneys basically saying, like, on its face, you're not in compliance with this law since you continue to misclassify workers as independent contractors. So that is the basic framework. And California is a big state and very important in terms of determining labor policy, but it's not the entire pie. It's certainly not the entire country. And so in many states, I've focused specifically on the ride-sharing companies in my work, though this issue obviously extends beyond them. Many states, they basically successfully lobbied state legislatures to adopt a gig employer-friendly versions of state law that kind of created special carve-outs for those gig workers to not be classified as employees. Some states, it remains ambiguous. I'm originally from New Jersey, and there was a big ruling by the state unemployment insurance court, basically, or the state unemployment insurance division last year that basically said that ride-sharing drivers in New Jersey were misclassified employees, and therefore Uber was responsible for a hefty unemployment insurance premium payout since they'd been basically just not paying what they owed for their workers for many years.
Right. So to the rescue comes Harvard Law School with its clean slate for a worker power report. And there's a lot in this report. It's interesting reading, but front and center is this sectoral bargaining proposal. So explain to us what sectoral bargaining is, and I guess what your assessment of this proposal is. And I also want to point out that one of the co-authors worked with Tom Perez. So I think, to the people who would look to Harvard Law for a solution to this problem, it's, leaders in the Democratic Party, maybe. So
yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to sort of suss out exactly what the sort of coalitional politics of that produce that report and that are generally on different sides of questions about how to regulate the labor market. So sort of taking the most general of your questions first, sectoral bargaining is the idea that labor standards, wages, and employment would be negotiated by with all of the employers in a sector on the part of one or more unions. So a union represents some or all of the workers in that sector and enters into a multi-party negotiation with all of the employers in that sector, and then the resulting agreement that they would come up with would purportedly be binding on all of the employers that employ anybody in that sector. And there's a very strong logic behind it, which is that a big problem both for workers who are unionized or unions representing workers who are unionized is that the employer can basically say we're under competitive pressure from other workers in this industry, so we can't really give you a raise because then that would put us at a disadvantage. And the idea is, well, sectoral bargaining would solve that kind of race to the bottom dynamic that can arise, especially in fragmented labor markets. And we have, I should say, this isn't totally unknown in the United States. We do have sectoral bargaining in, I would say, construction is the big industry that is sort of known for having it now. And this is sustained by various things like prevailing wage laws and kind of supervision at various levels of the bargaining process. And it has a logic in construction because there's lots of different employers and lots of different specialties, and any one project can involve multiple employers. There's a sense in which you sort of need to set labor standards on an occupational or sectoral level. And then historically, the garment industry was one that had sectoral bargaining where there were a lot of small employers that were kind of in competition with each other. That's a proverbial example where the employers basically liked the sectoral bargaining because it created a sense, a more organized and less competitive, frankly, setup in their industry. And then a big, pro-sectoral bargaining force in terms of kind of convincing people that this is a good idea is the fact that many other countries do it and do it very well, and certainly their workers have better labor standards than most workers in the United States. So most of Europe has some form of sectoral bargaining. Different countries have it more binding versus less binding. I was just looking at, there was actually a ruling of the state supreme, the equivalent of a state Supreme Court in Switzerland the other day, to the effect that an Uber driver was an employee under Swiss law, and the implication of that was that being an employee made him eligible for coverage of the taxi driver's sectoral bargain. So what that meant was that he had not been, I presume, he had not been paid the wage that is due to taxi drivers in Switzerland. And so by proving that he was an employee, and I guess by proving he's a taxi driver, under Swiss law, that meant that Uber was liable to pay more, that is, pay in accordance with what the contract said. So first of all, there's a reason why sectoral bargaining is attractive, and I don't want to say that it's bad. I mean, we're sort of leading up to, sort of what is this report doing and what's the dangers here. There's very good reason to go for it, and also we'll get into the U.S. case and why it might be sort of an alternative to this employee versus independent contractor distinction in a second. But the Swiss example I just referred to shows that it need not be, sort of, it need not substitute for the question of employment status. It can, in fact, be the question of employment status and the question of eligibility for coverage under a sectoral bargain, in fact, are complementary and go together in many contexts. So it's not like you can just say like sectoral bargaining bad, employment status good, or any sort of like place, any breakdown of that matrix, doesn't necessarily correspond to bad or good. It's kind of the devil's in the details type situation. Okay,
so yeah, these details. Where's the devil here?
Yeah, so this clean slate report is very long and includes lots of good stuff. It was published by some scholars at Harvard Law School, I think in late 2019, following an extensive consultation with lots of sort of labor-oriented scholars and activists and union types and sort of union-adjacent types. So, you can tell that this is sort of the product of a lengthy period of consultation, as opposed to just sort of some randos at Harvard. I mean, even if anybody's at Harvard is a rando, but some professors just sort of putting their ideas out there. What I think, so I'll just to sort of cut to the chase of what the problem is here, because it's not obvious just from looking at a report that says a lot of interesting and good things in it. The idea basically is that sectoral bargaining would undermine employment status or be offered as a substitute for employment status for workers in the gig economy, and then even beyond that, for workers who already have employment status, and even, sort of in the worst case scenario, workers who already are not just employees, but also union members. So employment is a precondition to union representation, at least under the National Labor Relations Act, which, as I said earlier, has this idea of employment being a crucial precondition to having the right to collectively bargain and be represented exclusively by a union. The idea is basically, well, so we're talking about employment versus independent contractor. The sort of alternative to that is what's been called somewhat informally a third category, which is to say a kind of, it's been referred to as an independent worker in some publications about this. But the idea is these are people who would not be eligible for the full benefits of employment law. They would not be fully employees, but also recognize they're not really independent contractors in the sense of the musician playing a gig. That is to say, they are under the control of some more powerful economic force that has a day-to-day sort of discretion, that they lack autonomy in relation to their boss. Some sort of gloss of employment without the full shebang. And the obvious idea behind the third category is this would retroactively legalize the business model of the gig economy platforms. So what I am articulating as my fear is that this idea of sectoral bargaining would essentially be a route to the third category. That is to say, you would surrender employment status and therefore surrender the potential for representation under the National Labor Relations Act, a federally protected union, in exchange for which gig workers would be represented, which I would put in quotation marks, by a labor union who negotiates sectorally with employers. Now, one of the weird things here is that in the gig economy, many of the employers are monopsonists in the formal sense, meaning that they control the entire labor market. So the kind of classical instance in which sectoral bargaining is used and used well is when there's fragmented employers. They're in competition with one another, and therefore there's downward pressure on labor standards, and then you want to sort of create a floor using a sectoral bargain. In the gig economy, you've got essentially monopsonists. So in ride sharing, it's like Uber with 75% of the market and Lyft with 25%. So that's, there's not really very many employers in that sector. And similarly for these sort of like task-based platforms and so on. The idea is you'll basically get a labor union that's kind of nominally representing them, but not in the NLRA way. In part, so what would that mean in practice? We don't know, because we don't really have non-NLRA unions in this country. I don't want to put all my reputational chips on that, because there's some ambiguity. Some labor unions basically predate the NLRA, or actually many do. So, there's sort of new arrangements that have then kind of been contorted into the ex post into the NLRA system. Interestingly, the Writers Guild is actually kind of falls into that category. But when I say that I'm worried about this, the crucial example that looms large in my mind is that Seattle, the city of Seattle, tried to create a kind of non-NLRA labor union for ride-sharing drivers there. This was after the misclassification challenges had failed in Washington. They said, well, why don't we can use our powers as a city council to basically have a sort of quasi-union collective bargaining arrangement in the ride-sharing context. Basically, Uber and the Chamber of Commerce went to war against that using antitrust law. So they basically said, collective bargaining, that is, sort of negotiating wages that apply to multiple different economic agents, is anti-competitive under the antitrust laws. Now, within antitrust law, there's something called the labor exemption. So that says that unions negotiating collectively bargained agreements cannot be in violation of the antitrust laws. That was in response to essentially antitrust being used mostly as an anti-union weapon in its early decades. And the claim by Uber and the Chamber of Commerce in that Seattle case was basically, these are workers outside the protections of the NLRA, which means they are outside the protections of the labor exemption to antitrust. So that you could see that labor exemption from antitrust as being, kind of one of the many things that attaches to employment status. They're outside that protection, therefore they have violated the Sherman Act, or more properly in the context of the case, the city of Seattle violated the Sherman Act by setting out this collective bargaining arrangement for gig economy workers. And basically in response to that successful challenge, first the city gave up negotiating over wages, so this purported union would not negotiate wages, which is like, that would be the main thing of negotiation in a collective bargaining arrangement. And then ultimately they moved to a different system, basically, where there's not collective bargaining. There is instead a sort of regulated taxi commission type regulation of ride sharing, which I guess, so that outcome is better than the status quo where it's totally unregulated, but it does not include employee representation in any meaningful way, and certainly no collective bargaining. So I'm worried. I mean, sorry, this is going on a little bit long. The idea basically is that this sort of sectoral bargain would kind of swoop in as a solution to the very fraught situation of employment status for gig workers, especially in California. The fight is going on right now. And they'd say, let's give up this employment thing. Let's, sort of like try to kind of calm down the head-to-head clash on that. Give the companies employment status, that is to say, independent contractor status, in exchange for which workers will be represented to some degree by some existing labor union to come to some sort of negotiation outside the NLRA. And I mean, among other, the NLRA requires a sort of democratic structure to labor unions. So the question is, would the employees represented in that sectoral bargaining actually be able to throw out the management of the union that negotiated the sectoral bargain if they don't like what they came to? I'd be very concerned that the answer to that is no, which would mean that if they come up with some sort of, anti-worker arrangement that basically gives the gig employers what they want, then the workers who are bound by that will kind of hate both their union and their boss, and that is a very bad situation from a worker's perspective, and certainly from a union perspective.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely an interesting shift to watch in reading that report, because people who listen to the show will understand for sure that so much of the story of lost wages and the declining standard of living for working people across this country has been the loss of robust unions, and a key weapon in that story has been this kind of legal maneuvering that we've seen in the way that we treat employees. So many people, especially people at the bottom of companies, people working janitor roles or things like that, are now treated as independent contractors, which is very much absurd, on its face for the most part. But I think that it's important for people to recognize, specifically talking about, Uber and Lyft and these gig economy workers, how much that means that the government is now subsidizing Uber and Lyft. You look at basically the pandemic response and the failure of these companies to have to pay for unemployment for all of these workers means that the government needs to step in. So I mean, I'd be curious if there's anything else that you could jump in with that, like the idea that like this independent contractor system and the way that it treats employees has really undercut the standard of living for most American workers.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think it's especially pressing in the case of the gig economy, because my view of the platforms, not just in the sort of labor context, Uber and Lyft and TaskRabbit or whatever, Instacart, but also in speaking of the platforms that do other things like Facebook and Google and Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
A big part of what makes those companies as valuable and as profitable as they are is the fact that they're basically exempt from the laws that bind the companies that and individuals who did the thing that those platforms have taken over. So, for example, I would consider Facebook to be a giant unregulated telecoms utility / media company that's kind of used its status as neither one of those things to evade the regulations that attend to both of them, and that is an enormously beneficial place to be in. So they have a whole mythology of innovation and breaking the status quo with new ideas and so on. And like the only idea that Silicon Valley has ever had in this regard that as far as I'm concerned, is basically regulatory arbitrage, namely figuring out somehow for those companies not to be bound by the laws and regulations that bind everyone else. In terms of the sort of subsidy that the government is giving to the companies, I basically agree with that framework. I mean, certainly. So my colleague Centric Paul and I wrote a letter that was signed by lots of academics to Congress shortly after the passage of the CARES Act that was about what you just mentioned, which is the pandemic unemployment assistance program basically created unemployment insurance for non-employed workers, so people who are not eligible for traditional unemployment insurance. That's great. That's what we needed in a pandemic. These workers should be eligible for social insurance. The problem was it's basically saying, oh, you didn't pay. It's saying to the purported, the would-be employers or gig supervisors, however you want to refer to them, you didn't pay your unemployment insurance premiums for all the years you've been in existence. And that has previously meant that your workers are not eligible for unemployment insurance payments. We're going to make your workers eligible for them. The federal government's going to come in basically with the money to fund that, and it's a sort of ex post bailout for the companies that weren't paying in for all those years. So I think that's true. I guess I would, I sort of, having kind of lived in the swamp of economics for my whole career, I'm kind of resistant to the terminology of like who's subsidized, who's like a rent seeker versus who's paying in, and kind of like winners and losers, because that's all very fraught. And I don't think particularly accurate. It's kind of buying into their framework to say like, oh, no, who's the real welfare sponge? The welfare queen's actually Uber. I mean, much as I want to kind of stick that to them, I think it's important to recognize that sort of no matter what happens, the government is structuring laws and markets, and including who's eligible for what benefits. And so, yeah, I mean, the current setup where you have these ride-sharing companies that are allowed to operate basically a nationwide taxi duopoly without adhering to regulated prices in the taxi market, let alone labor standards, that's definitely a more pro-Uber and Lyft set of laws and regulations than one in which there was employment classification and they had to abide by regulated prices. But it's not really more of a subsidy. It's like, it's not like who's getting taxed and who's getting subsidized. That's not, I think, ultimately that helpful of a framework.
I want to return to this Clean Slate report to just comment on the way it used New Deal history a little bit. It comments on things that we've talked about plenty of times, which is the exclusion of the domestic and agricultural workers, for instance, along racial lines. And I think it's obviously important things to bring up. But then it doesn't move to just say, well, we should just extend protections to those people. And that's especially suspicious in the light of the sort of like employment over gig workers thing, because they instead offer this like a full menu of representational solutions or something like that. Like I want to share this. I've got a paragraph here just to kind of give people the flavor of this. And it says, our goal is not restoring the labor movement, nor the economy and the politics of yesterday. This cannot be our objective because although American democracy and the American economy were more balanced when the labor movement was at its historic peak, Our society has always been profoundly exclusionary. Across our entire history, access to economic and political power has been unforgivably shaped by racial and gender discrimination, as well as by discrimination based on immigration status, by sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination, and by ableism. And truth be told, the American labor movement has itself often failed to insist upon a genuinely inclusive and equitable America. Am I wrong to be weirded out a little bit by the kind of where they drive these conclusions?
No, I think it is concerning. And, a lot of people had been kind of skeptical of the overplaying of the exclusionary aspects of the New Deal, I think exactly because they foresaw it leading to this kind of statement. So, none of that history on its face is wrong. And we are right to give a revisionist account of the New Deal and the political compromises that caused it to have the shape that it had. The problem is they're basically setting us up to do exactly the same thing again. And that's what really worries me, because essentially the argument would go something like this. In this purported kind of compromise that I've outlined, which is give up employment status in exchange for which get some sort of sectoral representation that is not protected by the NLRA in cooperation with the gig economy employers whom we just gave what we wanted to, workers in historically marginalized groups that occupy occupations that are low on the sort of hierarchy of occupations would be finally getting the union representation that they were denied by the exclusionary aspects of the National Labor Relations Act. The problem is you just gave up employment status and all the rights that are attendant thereupon for exactly the same sorts of service workers and exploited workers in casual labor that the New Deal also failed to protect. So, I think one of the great strengths of the New Deal was that the idea of a sort of federal floor that backed up by the enforcement powers of the federal government would act as an enormous equalizing tendency within the economy, so create what might be called a race to the top. That was the whole sort of exclusionary history of the New Deal, didn't arise because Southern politicians are bigoted or something, or there were, it was because the political economy of the South and conservative interests in the Democratic Party depended on creating a kind of carve out to nationwide economic standards. So it was like, okay, if you just move your factory down here, then you won't have to deal with those pesky unions anymore. We will keep a nice quiescent labor force there to be exploited on your behalf. This is sort of what I'm imagining here, what a proverbial sort of Southern capitalist would say to a Northern affiliate or financier or something like that. And, you can see that very clearly in the resistance in the South to the Great Migration, for example. If they were purely racist, they would have wanted the Great Migration to be to have happened earlier and to be, to have, fully emptied the South of all Black people. That didn't happen, and in fact, they very much were against the Great Migration because it basically created labor market opportunities for the population that had heretofore been ruthlessly exploiting. So, in terms of how that logic then gets kind of reused and weaponized in the current era, it's basically to give the gig economy employers exactly the carve out from federal labor law or any labor law that they have wanted so badly, and use the excuse that, like, oh, we did this before, therefore these are exploited workers, therefore this thing that we're giving you now, that is to say non-employment status, nominal union representation, is an improvement on that. And meanwhile, let's kick the ball another 100 years in the future, where we have yet another carve out for yet another generation or set of generations of low wage and exploited workers.
Yeah, it seems kind of complicated for the left to organize against, because as you kind of hinted at earlier, there's certain members of the organized labor that are going to be supportive of this. So what do you think? Where does big labor stand on this, and what do you think the left should do?
Yeah. Okay. Well, the last question is the easiest to answer in the immediate term, which is that Prop 22 is a thing that's on the ballot right now in California, which would give the gig economy employers a carve out from the California state law AB 5 that mandates this more stringent test for employment. So everybody should vote no on Prop 22. It would be galling if the state of California, having persevered so long, basically in the face of a great deal of opposition. I'm sure plenty of politicians and executives of gig economy firms and so on would have wanted to sell out much sooner. It's kind of astounding that it got this far. In terms of the law being on the books and the California Attorney General essentially moving to enforce it in a very forceful and seemingly effective way. If then by referendum those protections were to be lifted, that would be truly galling. And I think the gig economy firms are running a very, well, first of all, an extremely well-funded, extremely dishonest campaign to try to get this carve out for themselves. In fact, they have launched basically a harassment campaign against those of us scholars who have, in my view, been on the right side. Of course, that would include me, but who have advocated on the part of employment status for gig workers. We have been harassed online. I think Vina Dubal, who's a professor at the UC Hastings Law School, has been the greatest target of this online harassment. But she's not the only one. There was a good article in CNET about this. So, it's a very well-funded, very well-organized, extremely slick misinformation propaganda campaign to try to get people to think that, actually exempting the gig economy employers from labor law is somehow good for the workers. That's definitely not the case. I think, when we're talking about, so when you're talking about like, where's big labor on this, most labor unions, in fact, I mean, you could go as far as to say all unions rely on the National Labor Relations Act to one degree or another, which means that they rely on the continued importance of employment status, which means that most unions are not going to be friendly to the gig economy insofar as the gig economy entails the loss of employment status. And I think that has basically been, it is basically because the AFL and traditional labor unions have not acceded to the quote unquote compromise that so many other politicians and political forces in California have wanted. It is for that reason that the law exists as such, and so that's great. Unfortunately, there are some unions that would like to grow their membership rolls on paper at the expense of what I would view as at the expense of the interests of their members and also at the expense of other workers, because the real kind of threat here isn't, I mean, it is very much that gig economy workers would lack employment status. That has been the case and it should be rectified. The other problem is that through some sort of either the sort of push through in the California context or like a renegotiation of AB 5 or, in some other sort of sectoral bargain based third category imposition, you would basically undermine the labor standards for workers who are employed. And as I said before, even workers who are currently members of unions. So you could imagine a world where essentially, say, take as an example, Instacart, so that's one example, but also there's other gig economy firms that have a slightly different set of tasks or whatever, or areas that they cover. But imagine, an Instacart worker who shops on behalf of a customer, going into a grocery store and, filling the customer's order, in effect, that is putting a non-employed gig worker in the workplace of an employed worker and potentially in the workplace of a unionized worker. And so if that kind of, there's, these battles are hard fought, like certain job descriptions attached to employment status and union membership and representation and collective bargaining. So if you create a job description that's like very, very similar to an existing employed unionized job description, and then say, well, this job description is not eligible for any of the protections of either the collective bargaining agreement that union has entered into on his behalf or employment law more generally, but rather is a totally disempowered worker, then you can see why, employers would be like, well, why are we dealing with these union folks anymore? Like, we don't need employees. We can basically get what we want from people whose status is much lower. And that kind of, withering away. I mean, that's exactly, the idea that like in this world, labor standards would go down, but union representation would go up. That's kind of the trade-off that's being mooted. Like, that's pretty cynical, and I think not not many people who are on the left would take that deal if ultimately representing workers' interests is what we're all here for.
I mean, it's almost it goes as deep as the metaphor. Like, why do you want to get rid of all of that? We really need to clean the slate entirely, guys.
Well, I think, I mean, I don't want to get too well. I mean, maybe we should get cynical. Like, this is a philanthropic effort to sort of, you know, as they say, like reset everything. Like, yeah, I mean, there's big problems in the NLRA system. Most workers aren't protected by it. The report says that outright, and that is a big, you know, they're right to say that's a big problem, and we shouldn't go around only representing the interests and advocating on behalf of the interests of a aristocracy of labor. I mean, not that really any workers in today's economy have a good deal, but you know, insofar as there's like you know, some workers who have decent. I mean, this issue arose in the Democratic primary, for instance. So the idea that, you know, offering Medicare for all is somehow harmful to workers who have decent health insurance negotiated with their employers. First of all, I think, as was shown very authoritatively in that context, like even what's supposedly good health insurance deal negotiated by a powerful union isn't nearly as good as Medicare for all would be. And consequently, the workers who even benefit from that kind of don't agree with the pundits who say, oh, well, you know, they would have to give up something in exchange for this universal program. They're like, no, that looks a lot better than what I'm getting now. And just, you know, I think actual workers kind of aren't, don't like fall for that kind of cultivated disagreement, you know, so much as sort of more powerful people who claim to be advocating on their behalf. You know, so I guess nothing that I'm saying here should be construed as saying that like the NLRA system's great, we need to protect it at all costs, or you know, I you know, this is why I'm somewhat hesitant to you know, to go to war basically with something like that, because we do need a rethinking of labor law and labor policy more generally, and who counts as a worker in the economy. But, you know, I'm worried about the way that this is going. I think part of it is the fear that Prop 22 will pass. So that means that 85 will be gone. So then it's like, okay, well, what are we going to do then? So yeah, that should absolutely not happen. But, you know, I mean, I guess, you know, my view would be that at all times, an advocate for workers should ensure that whatever they're doing benefits workers, and that they oppose anything that undermines worker status. So a dynamic where workers feel sold out by a compromise that seemingly unites all factions of the political system, you know, that's kind of the most dangerous possible outcome. Like better keep the lines clear in terms of who's on whose side, even if you lose. You know who the enemy is and who to attack next time. That's how I would, you know, if Prop 22 goes through, you know, that's where I would think the fight should proceed. Not like, oh, okay, you know, let's kind of do a compromise that sort of looks like we're doing something on paper, but in fact the workers hate. And so that sort of blurs the question of like, who's your real enemy? Is it the boss or is it the union? You know, I mean, you know, any worker advocate should you know, always be on the side of union and avoid any situation in which the people you're claiming to advocate for are dissatisfied and detest the decisions you've made on their behalf.
Right. Well, Marshall, I think we'll have to get to the Nancy McLean was right conversation maybe next time you're on. But
fair enough.
Yeah, thank you so much for
yeah, this has been interesting. Yeah, thanks.
Really,
thanks. Glad I could do it. All right, have a good evening.
Yeah, you too.
I just learned a lot.
Yeah.
I'm curious to hear Marshall's thoughts on he talked about for 1 second the WGA, my union.
Yeah, it's tough. Like this report, I'll just share the sort of front page of it. Like there's a lot of like sort of the Ira Katz-Nelson thesis of like, you know, when affirmative action was white. Like there was severe structural problems with the New Deal, but they don't even then they go to say like, well, actually agricultural workers, they organize in different ways anyway, so maybe they wouldn't even been benefited by that, after, you know, blaming the New Deal being racist for not including that. It's a weird, I mean, we were just saying before we got on that you went out and bought Touré Reed's book, because it feels like if you read Touré Reed's book plus this report, it feels, I don't know, it makes me a bit suspicious of it. That's all.
Well, that's what was worrying to me. I mean, honestly, like I mean, there's two things to say. It's like one thing that's frustrating about the clean slate is that what they're essentially arguing for is like, hey, look, there's a problem with our current, labor laws. And then they're saying, okay, so we're going to wipe it and we're going to now accept the framing of some of the most predatory institutions in the country, which is, the gig economy, right? And say like, oh, we're going to create multiple different like employment statuses for people, right? It's like, so it's like you're giving up this massive fight. And the reason that you're arguing for it is to say like, oh, it's because the old system had flaws. And it's just like, yes, but that doesn't mean that like this other system is going to be much better, especially,
I mean, very specifically, the flaws weren't that the old system wasn't fragmented enough and specialized enough. The problem was the old system didn't apply to everybody. Like it didn't apply to enough people. So like when they come at you with, well, this will actually create a whole, they literally say a menu of representational options. And it's like, I don't know, that language in itself is not, I think, appropriate for the sort of labor movement and what's going to be good for labor. It's not about having the right choices like you're like at the grocery store for labor. I don't know.
Yeah, man, it's not good. And it's just like, I mean, this kind of fight of attacking the legacy of the New Deal, from the left, quote unquote, from the left, has been such a, major part of like the last 20 years. And it's frustrating because it's like, there are like serious legacies of the New Deal that like need to be, the truth needs to be told about them and the problems need to be pointed out. But what's underneath a lot of the popular ones, especially the ones that we're seeing from organizations like this, is that like, yeah, look, that's what happens. Like that's as good as it can get.
Yeah.
And it was, you had to have the bad aspects of it to have the good. It's like, that's not the case, right? It's like, you can get rid of the bad and have the good.
There's no Southern Democrats anymore. So really, who's the hang up? And it's because we know it's the finance Democrats.
Yeah, the corporate Dems have replaced the Southern Dems. Shall we do a brief pitch?
Yeah.
Are you in the mood to see if I can remember the name of the patron website address? Is it that time of night?
Yeah.
I just want to thank everyone who's continuing to join us. I think we're kind of in a state of transition and evolution, and we're definitely having to rebuild and move forward. And I'm hoping that, and the three of us are hoping that in upcoming weeks and months we can start to have think tanks, especially with our group of patrons, about what the future of this project looks like and how we shape it together. So please join us, and we want you to be part of that. It is patreon.com/TMBS, and we have a Sunday show. Last Sunday, Matt and David revisited the Vampire's Castle. It was a great think tank. And then the Sunday before, we aired an interview with Michael and his, coach, mentor, Susan Green. And I kind of contextualized that interview. So there have been the last 2 Sundays, we've had really great episodes. So definitely become a patron. And you also can have a lot of fun with us in the post game. That's what I've got for the pitch if anyone wants to add on anything fun.
I think that's good. I mean, I just will reiterate, Sunday was fun because we talked about the Vampire Castle, but we really talked about Russell Brand.
I should have said Russell Brand, yes.
And if there's anybody equipped to escape a Vampire Castle, it is Russell Brand.
Mr. Brand. I'm really devastated that Michael and Russell never got to spar or
He was
chat.
on that list.
Yes, for sure.
Russell actually had a pretty interesting, right after he finished that episode, my friend sent me some Russell Brand clips. He had a really interesting conversation with Giannis Varoufakis, which was sort of two titles, which is worth checking out.
Maybe we'll have another think tank about that.
Yeah. This is Russell Brand on it.
Maybe we'll just a Russell Brand think tank from now
on. Let's do a gem, David.
Yeah, let's do this gem real quick. And man, I put something in the outline that we can maybe pull up in a little bit. So this is something I just want to contextualize a couple things, especially what's been going on, primarily reading, FT lately. So, Chairman Powell, the Federal Reserve, went to Congress today and basically was pleading with them that there needs to be direct fiscal support to small and medium-sized businesses, not just loans, because there is a significant part of the economy that really is continuing to be left behind by the failure of Congress to act in the middle of this massive pandemic. And look, the Federal Reserve has a lot of issues, but what they've been doing primarily, is by practicing loose monetary policy, making sure that, you know, asset prices can continue to stay stable. They've been, you know, buying a significant amount of bonds, you know, around $120 billion worth a month. And what happens in that kind of situation is the people who have access to that kind of cheap money, what do they do with it? Well, they're trying to look for a return. And as you start to see, you know, their possibilities to have a, you know, interest payments or, you know, a rate of profit, you're seeing more and more of that money going into riskier and riskier assets. And that's why you're also seeing so much money going into the stock market right now, because really, if you're looking for growth, there aren't really a lot of opportunities that are, you know, giving you that much of a return on your investment, which creates a very one, fragmented system where there's a small amount of people who are profiting immensely, but two, a very risky system where a lot of people are basically putting their money into anything that seems like it's going to have a return on investment, and all it is going to take is a you know, any kind of downturn for that to have really catastrophic effects for everybody. You know, and we're seeing people trying to, like, obviously Trump is full of nonsense right now, trying to you know, talk about the unemployment numbers going down. You know, remember the official numbers, it's like something like 8.4 unemployment right now. Remember, that's not the same as like the real unemployment rate, which that's going to count people who have been discouraged by the labor market, people who are working marginal jobs, you know, or basically people who want to work more hours, but aren't, you know, able to find more hours, right? That rate's more like 16.8%. We're still facing a significant economic crisis for most Americans. And we're starting to see some really frightening examples of that, where you're starting to see retail spending in the most recent report for, you know, September. That's gone down significantly. And that's one of the earliest indicators of what's happened since we've lost all the stimulus money and since we've lost those extended unemployment benefits for so many people who were relying on that money. So in that situation, where we're seeing retail start to slow down, and a lot of people are warning that as that money dries up for the average, you know, American, we're not going to see the kind of growth that we're seeing, which is not enough in the first place, because there's not enough money coming into like the average American, you know, working family. And Matt, if you could put that tweet up real quick. This is a problem, one, because of, you know, what's going on in people's lives, but also it's a complete political failure from the Democratic Party to rise to this occasion when people are really feeling hurt economically. So this was a survey that came out from the FT that said, survey showed voter anger targeting both sides of the aisle, with a plurality of 39% saying Democrats and Republicans were equally responsible for the failure to pass additional economic aid. This political moment right now should be a slam dunk for the Democratic Party, but they have largely failed at meeting this moment. And like, obviously, the Republican Party and Donald Trump are, you know, trying to prevent you know, the kind of stimulus or economic program that we'd want to see in this situation. But the fact is that pretty much everybody recognizes right now that we're living through a massive economic crisis, and it should be easy politics to basically get people, you know, behind you to say, okay, we need to have action now. And they fail to be able to do that because for the most part, they're uninterested in looking out for, you know, the average American worker.
Yeah, they're compromised by business. I mean, the CARES, like, these people are not wrong to be mad at both sides. Like, obviously the GOP is in the driver's seat here, but the way Nancy Pelosi negotiated the CARES Act to give everything away, every bit of leverage to corporations for like $1,200 check, which like did good. That was nice, but it should have been recurring. And like, I have a lot of anger I basically am equally mad at the GOP and Democrats. Like,
yeah, and it's like, look, people can point to things like the HEROES Act, and they can say, look, people are trying to pass legislation through the House. The fact is that you have to understand, the political moment right now, and you have to start appealing to the general people and the public. And this kind of idea that, you know, having a story on the third page of the New York Times about like, oh, how we passed another bill and it didn't get, you know, seen in the Senate, that's not going to win politics, right? This is a massive political moment where you're seeing people are in the streets for, you know, a host of issues right now. And this is a moment where a lot of people are feeling very fed up with the system. And just the fact that, like, look, I'm not a political strategist for the Democratic Party. I'm not a Democrat. I'm a socialist, right? But you just see this massive opposition party right now in a moment where people are clamoring for some kind of action, completely fail to appeal to the people and to make, the politics of the moment clear to them, is very frustrating. And it's frightening when we recognize, the stakes of this upcoming election, with a continuation of a disastrous Donald Trump presidency. The fact that they're not already walking away with this right now, and the fact that they've actually failed so much on a public relations level that the average person is blaming them as much as the GOP, that's a problem.
Yeah. And, I think you don't have to be a Democrat. You can be anyone on the left to feel really disappointed and frustrated that we need this opening to let our agenda maybe even have a chance of surviving compared to what, could happen under another 4 years of Trump. So it is really, really angering to see, essentially the Democrats block any chance of a Bernie presidency and then be fumbling so badly. It's completely maddening. I mean, that kind of goes without saying.
Like the thing with the HEROES Act, propose that after you give the GOP everything they need. And then like the idea, just the framing of, heroes, like everybody as a known person knows they need some fucking money to like sustain themselves. We don't need to be told we're heroes. The only people the heroes is for like the asshole, like rich suburbanites who the Democrats are really trying to not offend. That's...
You don't identify as a hero, Matt?
I don't need to call on the hero by the Democratic Party to know that like get some money into people's pockets during a pandemic. That's,
Well, should we get into this Jeremy conversation? Yeah, I think what happened was Jeremy and I realized that once we started talking, there was just so much to hit on. Michael did a live stream on July 16th. It's titled Integral Theory, but he touches on a lot more than that, and everyone should go in and check it out. I reference it, but I don't ever mention the title. And we basically kind of watched about 8 minutes of that stream, and then we kind of just jumped off of, where Michael left off, or we started, kind of contextualizing just the kind of wavelength that Michael was on, especially in recent, months and weeks leading up to, his incredibly sudden death, about really how he saw cosmopolitan, socialism being able to root itself and expand and become a tool to unify and get really strategic and savvy and strong on the left. So I just want to mention the name of the live stream and also say that I think this will be the beginning of many conversations about strategy and resilience and new ways of thinking. So I hope you guys enjoy this conversation.
All right, folks and patrons, we will see you in the post game.
I am here with Jeremy Johnson, and I'm making him re-record this intro because I butchered the name of his book, and I wanted to do it justice. So Jeremy is an author, host of a podcast, editor, and his book, the infamous Seeing Through the World, Gene Gepsler and Integral Consciousness. Did I do it?
Almost. Gepsler.
Jeremy was a dear friend and colleague of my brother's. He hosts the podcast Mutations. Got that one?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. Yeah.
Michael is on episode 5. You definitely should check out that conversation. And Jeremy, I think the last time you had a kind of longer conversation with Michael on TMBS was episode 103. And today, Jeremy and I watched Michael's live stream, which everyone should check out, from July 16th. Michael had this really beautiful live stream. It's about 20 minutes. And we're about to play a clip, and it's like the 8 minutes in the middle, and Michael just really gets going and just really starts breaking down what this, international cosmopolitan socialist, kind of theory and what he meant by that, and what he thought we needed to be open to, and how we had to be nuancing and widening our thinking to really get there. And Jeremy, if you just want to say hello, I love your Jacobin. I love your Against the Web. Thanks for that.
Of course, glad to represent. But yeah, again, thank you for having me on TMBS. It's an honor to be speaking with you and to be talking with the TMBS community. I think this video is a really good example of the kind of thinking Michael was advocating for that the left needed, and that really kind of comes across, and we'll talk about it in the recording after his clip, that, you know, complex thinking and flexibility and empathy are just so vital for the left. And this is really a kind of, like, I think we mentioned this as well, like, this is what our project is, you know, like in terms of what do we do now, and how does the left continue to evolve. And I think Michael had a very clear vision.
So this is a model that is about, like, what does it actually mean to be truly global to the extent we can, local, national, and international simultaneously, east, west, north, south, but from a place of actual growth and empathy. And this is where, again, this questions of consciousness come in. The questions of cultivating empathy, cultivating compassion, cultivating awareness, the complete antithesis of social media modes. Long-term thinking, compassion, seeing complexity, comfort with oneself, solitude, the opposite of instant gratification, the attempt to constantly humanize and not dehumanize your fellow humans. These are all completely countervailing forces to the market technologic that subsumes all of us today. And so integral theory, which is something that a lot of, it covers a lot of people. Sri Aurobindo was a great Indian integral theorist. William Irwin Thompson was a fascinating public intellectual. The most well-known guy is probably a guy named Ken Wilber, who I'll tell you, in my opinion, has some, he's, when it comes to things like politics, policy, history, this is not the guy, I'll put it very diplomatic, it's just not his strong suit. He's not informed or up on that stuff, and it affects his analysis. But this model has definitely created some brilliant maps of integrating worldviews, which we really need to do. We need to have a much greater understanding of both how other people are seeing, experiencing, and then enacting in the world. This is a necessity. It's a necessity with all of the extraordinary splits in the United States and the kind of serious analysis we need to figure out even the different types of ruling class right now in this society. Thank you so much. And it also is going to be very necessary as the United States declines, relatively speaking. That's one of the things, that shows up in the China coverage on the show. Of course, we need to talk about the crisis dealing, and the horrific repression of the Uyghurs as an example. And I care quite a bit about the Tibetan oppression as well. But we also need to understand, literally, the Chinese worldview to the extent we can. We need to understand these things, not in in a bipartisan way, and well beyond that boring word in the United States. Not in that milquetoast centrist, we all just figured out and meet in some crappy middle, but literally that we need to humanize as many as possible and then try to create cohesion to enact real systems change. Because right now you see so much of these velocity of serious social action in the United States. I mean, we're still hugely behind. There isn't the countervailing force of labor to capital. These uprisings are extraordinary. Where are they going? In some good directions, but also the new boon in the toxic, horrifying, grotesque HR industry, the diversity consulting scam, which is often just companies covering their asses from discrimination lawsuits they should face with very little empirical basis in the research, and then, of course, a renewal and another cycle of the horrifying toxicity of online culture. So we need to get to this place of humanization, understanding, and synthesis. And ultimately, my frame is that cosmopolitan socialist frame. That's what I'm most excited about. But the integral frame, what it does is it has, among other things, a quadrant model, which I think is fascinating. I'll just explain it to that. This is the book. It's not a great, I mean, it's a good book. It's got some good theory. It's very dated in other ways, but it's got some good outlines here. It's called The Theory of Everything by Ken Wilber. And the quadrants map different views of the world. What you have on the right side is objective systems, and on the left side, subjective systems. And then you have at the base social, and at the top individual. I could be actually mixing those up. So in other words, let's take it, really clearly. You're an individual. You're dealing with something like depression, which familiar with. There could be subjective and objective components of it. Maybe maybe there's something happening with you physiologically. You address it that way. But then there's also deep questions of your life and meaning and how you feel and how you treat others and how you're treated. And those are the subjective realms. They both matter. In the social systems, there's objective systems. There's objective systems. That this is the way we move currency. This is how technology works. This is how economy works. But then there's always cultural stories that correlate with them, right? This is, again, we go back historically, we look at the rise of the taxonomy of European racism and white supremacy. It correlates. There's the expansion of colonialism and imperialism, and then we do, and then those cultures manifest taxonomies of other human beings and stories and narratives, religious and quote unquote scientific, to justify racism. So those things are working in the objective and subjective realms. And so what he does is he kind of shows you that a lot of different worldviews, they all can have validity, but they're usually coming from one of these different viewpoints. A lot of people will say, like, okay, the main source of the action is individual subjectivity, right? The main source of the action is individual objectivity. The main source of the action is social materiality, or the main source of the action is cultural stories and myths. And the answer from Wilber, and the answer actually, if you read Gramsci in a certain way, is integral, and then it's all of the above. And then we start to have this perspective of wanting to have some flexibility in how we look at things, and a deep tolerance, like the tolerance that someone like Pepe Mujica talks about. Not a kind of, you just got to tolerate everybody. It's deeper, because also ultimately you do. It's another dynamic. Tolerate everything. You have battles in politics, but you want to understand the engine of different worldviews. And in that mix, he's including, and meta-modernism in certain ways points to this, and certainly, Jeremy Johnson, the contemplative work. And at its best, some connection to a spiritual practice or any type of conscientious cultivation of empathy. Now, we're all trying and we're all failing. That's the point. That also cultivates the self-compassion. Is going to give us some of the capacity to have some of the sort of flexibility of mind and emotions to move in between worldviews, pivot in between them, and start to create some of that synthesis. That sort of real range of empathy and intellect.
Well, that's quite a dense clip. I feel like there's multiple, it seems like Michael is kind of writing many theses within that, that was only part of a 20-minute live stream. I suggest everyone go and watch all 20 minutes. But Jeremy, do you want to just start off with just this idea of how, I guess my takeaway, and maybe this is different than yours, but I guess the fundamental thread that I hear Michael's touching on is cultivating this deep empathy and this ability to not only understand our truth and be clear in that, but also understand that there can be so many truths. And I feel like so much of what Michael practiced and emulated was deep empathy and compassion and clarity that there was great evil and really horrific things happening in the world, but also everyone's reality is valid and that is their truth. So I know that's like quite a jumping off point, but that was kind of, I don't know, at least how I interpreted what he was getting at.
No, I thought essentially the same thing in this presentation. Like, we need to have empathy for where people are coming from, but it's not enough just to have the intellectual assessment that, okay, here's the historical analysis, or here are the general conceptions of this particular worldview. We also have to go, like, what is the experience that people are enacting in the world? Why are they driven to do this? Like, can I empathize enough with them to understand? And I think it's also important that he did mention, like, political battles are still going to happen. There's still going to be conflict. It's just, we have to be coming from a place where we really understand our opponent, in a sense. And almost, I used to practice martial arts when I was a little younger, and there's this kind of sense of really kind of becoming your opponent in that sort of exchange, on the battlefield or in the dojo, or whatever you want to call it. So, like, I think there is this empathy taking that's really important, and it's central to a capacity to take that other position. And you need both. You need, like, the empathetic capacity, which is like a consciousness capacity, and then you also need more of the kind of cognitive, intellectual curiosity to go ahead and, you know, read your opponents and read what the intellectual dark web is talking about and how they're organizing their worldview. If you can't, then you're not really going to be able to reach them. You're not really going to be able to understand their motivations and drives. And ultimately, you know, it's doing a disservice to, you know, the ultimate aims that Michael was talking about in terms of creating a better world, creating a more, you know, cosmopolitan socialism, an ecumenical planetary culture, you know. So we need that capacity. It's like, I think it's really, that was what I got from it. Just, we need to develop these capacities, both of empathy and cognitive flexibility. And so integral theory for Michael, and for me as well, was like an introduction to that. And he kind of goes into the quadrant analysis, and he talks about, you know, you have to kind of consider the subjective and the intersubjective and the systems, but then also the individual, and then also maybe, you know, the biological and medical. So, like, everything's kind of in that picture. But I like to think of integral theory as a sort of like a training wheel situation, where it's teaching us to think with complexity and kind of nudging us to make that a daily practice in terms of, like, understanding what's going on in the world. And as a start.
Yeah, no, I think it's important. And I see this behavior in myself, and I see it a lot on the left, where lots of times the impulse to kind of narrow one's thinking or shut something out comes from a reaction of, like, seeing something that feels really grotesque or hateful. And so the impulse is to, like, protect the people around you or protect yourself from this type of thinking. But then, you know, it's challenging terrain to navigate, like, you know, retraining your brain to hold multiple truths, but also not make any, you know, justification or exceptions for things that just truly need to end. You know, Michael was so good at saying, like, it's disgusting, that's bad analysis, that's incorrect. But I think oftentimes the reason he was able to speak just so definitively and so clearly was because he was holding so many truths at once. It wasn't just that he kept, we talked about this yesterday when we were on the phone, like the idea of not just reading to reinforce your worldview. Exactly. So I guess when I'm listening to Michael, when I'm listening to you, and, you know, my understanding of integral theory is very thin. I've read a little bit of Wilbur. It kind of ends in the color wheel of it all. But it's like, kind of, how do we encourage, you know, feeling like you're standing in what's important to you culturally and morally, but also challenging yourself to kind of stretch your thinking, not to compromise what you feel is right and wrong, but to deepen and make what you feel or see as right and wrong in the world something that you can kind of express and connect with more people around. Mm-hmm. Is that kind of what you see that?
Yeah, like almost developing a kind of resiliency, like knowing you can go into a different media bubble and actually know that language and still be firmly situated in a critique of it. But actually your critique goes deeper because you're really kind of hearing, empathizing, understanding that orientation or perspective worldview, and then being able to, there's more power in that. There's more power in them actually feeling like your opponent actually feeling heard and acknowledged and not straw manning their position, and really getting under their skin in a way. And I think that develops a capacity in you of resilience in being able to do that, right? So I think Against the Web was a good example because Michael was engaging with the IDW for a number of years and Sam Harris and all that stuff. I don't know how deeply we want to go into all that, but he was able to really kind of look at what they were actually saying and at least take it seriously enough to deconstruct it. And then I think the other element of this isn't just deconstruction and kind of like winning over the right, but really kind of answering some of these very human drives that would drive people towards, the IDW in terms of meaning making, spirituality, living a meaningful, fulfilling life, which is very difficult. And what did he call it? The market techno logic, right? This sort of deep sense of atomization so many people are feeling. And so, we have to look at the motivations and drives that people are going to these communities or orienting around, and what those are actually like subjectively like. And then when you do that, I think you stand a better chance to say like, look, I understand where you're coming from. I understand the tensions here, but here's another offering. And I think this is what he really wanted to do, Michael, in the sense of like offering a constructive, regenerative, synthesis-oriented left, which was not afraid of spirituality, not afraid of meaning making, but also deeply, deeply rooted and grounded in material analysis. And yeah, I mean, I think, but to do that, we really kind of need this capacity for intellectual curiosity. I've been floating this word around. It's from a paper by Neri Oxman. She's calling it anti-disciplinarity, just like really being voracious in our intellectual curiosity and jumping across disciplines and looking at different perspectives and just sort of seeing how those differences can actually kind of combine into something novel and emergent. And so I think Michael was just really good at that, just naturally. And so integral theory for him was like, that's kind of my brain, right? Mm-hmm. So, and I think he was encouraging the left to take that up as a capacity because, as he says, like it's so necessary today.
So how do you see this like work moving forward? Like, how do you see, our job on the left to kind of try and get people more interested in making this like more interesting and more exciting, more accessible, and not kind of like, there's a bit of a barrier of entry, I think, with some of this because it's, not always written in the most accessible ways.
Yeah, no, and especially with this material, like integral theory and some of these sort of subcultural movements that we're interested in, like Michael mentions meta-modernism or like meta-systemic thinking. There are a lot of barriers to, I think, like really kind of grokking that and studying it. So you do need to be kind of a voracious readers. But I do think like with the TMBS audience, there was, and Michael's he was really good at encouraging people to read and to learn. And so there was like definitely a pedagogical element to this platform. And there still is. I love that you guys are still like doing the reading lists and you had that Michael reading list. So I think that is more important than necessarily deep diving Ken Wilber, but like you and I were talking, maybe that could be something that the TMBS community does is sort of like a reading group. I'd be happy to like help facilitate something like that.
That'd be awesome.
But, I think part of it is also kind of the role of having platforms like this that sort of mediate these deep dive research avenues that are very useful and helpful, and kind of coming back with like, hey, check out this particular theory. This is really helpful for the left, and then promoting it and translating it into something that's sort of engaging, like a documentary, like Illicit History, you know. So I think the media role actually in this is like really, really crucial. And so I see a lot of potential.
You're looking at it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So Michael, recommended Wilbur as like kind of, someone to check out. Is there other authors or books that you kind of want to, throw out there for people who are interested in kind of getting their feet wet in this realm?
Yeah. So Wilbur definitely, and he, Michael had all those caveats about Wilbur's politics, but A Theory of Everything is interesting. There's this book from the 90s, which is kind of interesting, and it's sort of his major tome called Sex, Ecology, Spirituality, and it's this massive, but I still recommend it. It's interesting, and you can kind of see the evolution of his thinking in that, and it's a good example of his synthesis. But I'd also recommend, for those who are interested, Edgar Moran. He's a French thinker, and he also is very interested in complexity thinking, and he has a book called Homeland Earth. That would be really good. It's a beautiful book. Obviously, Gene Gebster, I've got my book back there, Seeing Through the World, but that's sort of an introduction to Gebster's work, because he's this, mid-century tome-ish writer. His book's up there. It's a big text. It's kind of difficult and dense and so forth. So I would say my book is a good introduction to that, but really that whole realm of like integral thinking. Michael mentioned Sri Aurobindo in the video. I think he would also be quite good. There's a few different Sri Aurobindo readers, but like there isn't really an integral reader per se. It's people like Michael and maybe like myself were the ones who are trying to go like, okay, let me kind of create this curative synthesis and point out, there's a tradition here that we should be looking at, right? Where spirituality and kind of the history of consciousness mingled with trying to understand the social crisis and material crisis that we're in. I would probably also recommend one more, and this is something Michael and I were talking about a little bit, but Gloria Anzaldua's work, it's called Light in the Dark. It's an adaptation of her dissertation. And I think she's just a wonderful example of integral-oriented synthesis of spirituality, activism, feminism. And it was edited by her colleague, Gloria Anzaldua's colleague, Anna Louise Keating. And so that's a whole other avenue, but there's so much out there. Mm-hmm.
Do you mind if we jump topics a little bit? I just, for me, I always am like so curious to kind of get more personal, and so you're on the hot seat now. I'm just kind of curious how you got into all of this, and just a little bit about like your journey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think I've just always been very curious about consciousness studies, and I was a bit of a weirdo in undergrad, and I was reading, books on psychedelics and shamanism and that whole countercultural literary circuit. But I was really interested actually in Teilhard de Chardin's concept of planetization. And I just felt like integral theory, Desjardins, Gebster, I started to read all of these guys in undergrad. And I was in a sociology undergrad program, right? And I was like constantly throwing these like books at my professors, and they're like, well, maybe you should read more, critical theory. And so I kind of integrated that. And so to me, it just seems like, and it seemed like then, and it seems like now, that like we shouldn't silo those particular thinkers into just like a counterculture, that maybe there are these ideas about planetization and global thinking and global solidarity are just deeply resonant. And I think even back in like 2009, 2010, when I was really getting into this stuff, it was very obvious. I mean, there was the banking crisis, and then there was Occupy. And so I just felt like that global current, right, in those times, and then in these thinkers and writers. So I was just zapped in.
Yeah. I see such a parallel there, with what we kind of silo to the counterculture, and this is across the board in terms of, you know, philosophies or, you know, Eastern medicine or alternative, you know, health or meditation or yoga. And I feel like for so long it was like, okay, that's counterculture. It's weird. It's not as valid as what we have on the West. And then very quickly it got co-opted and became this like hyper elite, you know, we were talking about this the other day, like the Goop, you know, Gwyneth Paltrow effect, where they kind of jumped from like something that was kind of like lesser or other to something that was like elitist and stupid. And I feel like that was like a really quick whiplash with a lot of just, you know, things that like traditionally were just accessible to all people. And, you know, I guess I'm thinking about in my life, you know, in my upbringing, Ken Wilber, you know, Buddhist meditation practice, eating healthy, you know, herbal medicine, all those things kind of interweave. And I as an adult, am kind of trying to re-enter with kind of new eyes and be less jaded or less judgmental around some of the dysfunction I was raised around in people experimenting with some of the stuff in the counterculture, and like rediscovering the validity and truth. And then also kind of having some like rage around how it has been co-opted and kind of taken away and become elite, and I feel like similar to religion, there's a lot in the counterculture that we on the left should be allowed to like reclaim and make accessible to everyone and make, you know, part of our conversation. I think there's definitely a through line there. I know I'm kind of connecting a bunch of stuff, but I guess for me, it's all kind of in one domain.
Yeah, for me too, though. Like, I mean, even if you look at the history of spiritual countercultures, even if we go back like 100, 200 years, like the spirituality hasn't always been, or meaning making hasn't always been, you know, necessarily a conservative movement. It's been very often a kind of resistance to industrialization or resistance to, you know, the dehumanizing practices and policies of colonialism. It's been associated with the rise of feminism and kind of progressive values as well, you know. But in, I think, the 1970s and 80s, like we could take the historical look at that as well and see how, you know, a kind of romantic spiritual movement really kind of making pretty interesting claims in the sense of like, how do we live in a post-industrial, post-capitalist future that is spiritual, right? That is regenerative, that may have certain forms of religious imagination, but in service to and in favor of this, you know, like Charles Eisenstein says, this more beautiful world that our hearts know is possible, as cheesy as that sounds. But you can kind of trace how it gets co-opted. There's very interesting books about that. Like I think Fred Turner's book from counterculture to cyberculture kind of looks at the 1970s countercultures and how they get kind of co-opted by 1980s cyberculture in Silicon Valley and that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's a mixed bag, you know, and that's the kind of thing that I think Michael is really good at pointing out, that spirituality is important, but yes, we can critique the way it's sort of been co-opted by market forces. Absolutely. But the radicality of meaning making that some of these traditions holds, even if just as a promise, is again radically post-capitalist or even anti-capitalist if we really, you know, look at what some of the things that these traditions are saying. So, you know, I think it's more of like trying to revive and radicalize the potential that's sort of in these countercultures or in these communities, which is easier said than done, obviously, but that's like with everything, right? I mean, it's the same kind of forces and drives that we see happening with like woke corporate culture. It's like, right, there's very important things about social justice that are going on. There's a lot of like an awakening of social consciousness right now, and that also could become co-opted. So right, you got to hold them together. You know, we have to have an integrative approach, or we're going to just continue to, you know, fight each other. And that's exactly what the sea in which we swim is sort of really encouraging that sort of ecological sense of there are environmental pressures to be siloed and fragmented and to allow things to be co-opted. And, you know, the difficulty, I think, is finding a way to cross those disciplines and silos and really finding a way to connect with one another. And again, spirituality, you know, it's the elephant in the room that I think the left could really use. And I think Michael strongly agreed with that. And our conversations in the summer leading up to that video, we had a few phone calls, and that was the strongest theme in our conversations. Like, how can we bring spirituality critically, right? Like, again, with that critical analysis, and really integrate that and synthesize that into the left's project if we want to reach folks like who are in the IDW, et cetera, or just scale it, right? And just like not be fighting each other and not sniping each other on Twitter. You know, what is the sort of spiritual culture we can enact that is radically regenerative and connecting and empathetic, right? And not, you know, again, the opposite, which is what we have right now.
Yeah, I think Michael was just very serious about winning, being strategic, and using everything we have. And I think he just thought it was such a mistake to not like go to this deep reserve of knowledge and depth and wisdom that, you know, there's hundreds of years of tradition based on. That doesn't justify like the horrific things that have been done in the name of spirituality and religion. But, you know, I think he was just really starting to realize in his personal life, in his personal journey, that you really need something more to kind of ground yourself on if you're really going to dig in and do this work. So Jeremy, I feel like there'll be so many more conversations to come, and there's, you know, a group of people, and I'm so happy that Michael was in conversation with you and you guys were doing this work, you know, in parallel, you know, in relationship to each other. And unfortunately, you know, we won't get to see Michael's fully realized version of this, you know, cosmopolitan socialist, you know, ideology or theory or whatever. You know, I think it was just growing. And, you know, I really think that the sky was the limit in terms of what was going to kind of percolate in his what is it? The ideas forever tainted, these high level ideas. But I'm just so grateful to have you as a resource, and, you know, continue to have these conversations and continue people to take the good and leave the bad in a lot of these ancient practices and traditions and contemporary theories.
Thank you, Leisha. Me too.
Yeah, thank you so much.
As a sort of like ongoing conversation, you know, it would be great if the TMBS community come forward if they're interested in exploring these ideas. It would be fantastic if maybe we can organize something and keep the conversation going. So thank you again.
I'd really like that. I feel like we were kind of given this like final, like a bit of like a marching order from that live stream. And I'd love to hear from people, see if this interests you, if this speaks to you. And all right, much love. I look forward to speaking again soon. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks, Leisha.
Bye.